Hi, and welcome to the Introduction to the Medical Devices Regulatory Landscape. My name is Tobias Streich. I'm working as a Director of Regulatory Affairs for Siemens Healthineers. My team and I are responsible to identify, assess, and implement changing regulations in medical devices regulatory landscape worldwide and to inform our R&D departments about their new requirements. This is a high-level introduction to regulatory landscapes. If you need more, follow the links in the slides or contact me via LinkedIn. Have fun now with the session in the COVID-X project. Well, today I'm talking about the introduction into the medical devices regulatory landscape. Regulatory affairs is the discipline to access a market that is controlling products and institutions. Medical devices and pharmaceuticals, like automotives and aerospace industries, are a highly regulated market. That means you like reading fine print, tons of it, laws, regulations, guidances, standards. And if you're keen into that one here, use the link below to apply for a job. Of course, when it comes for regulatory affairs, you don't need to believe what I'm saying or what everybody's saying, but you can refer to sources and places where you can look for details. There's an app for that. So everything that I'm showing today is referenced with hyperlinks where relevant in the slides. So regardless whether you're accessing the European market or want to have a sneak peek into the US FDA's regulatory scheme, follow the hyperlinks and you will get more important information and guidelines how you can access the markets for medical devices. Now, regulatory affairs is a very interesting discipline. Sometimes your decisions play into the game when you look into the business principles and into the business strategy. Usually a product starts with a vision, sometimes just a simple drawing, having an idea and sketching it onto a paper. That idea, of course, comes from urgencies from stakeholders who create the demand and who somehow indicate that there is a market. They indicate also that there is a problem which needs to be addressed, either not better as the current state of the art or with less resources, or there is no comparable solution after all. So this is where regulatory comes into play. You need to encompass all the requirements that are coming from stakeholders, and you need to ensure that documentation in the R&D team is aware and is drawn up so that you can present that to regulatory authorities where requested. Now, of course, money comes from selling devices. So you might want to aim for short-term wins, learning how to access the market. And of course, here, depending on the value associated with your product, either you want to penetrate a market, that is to reach as much customers as possible in the least time available, or you want to dedicatedly select your customers, maybe key accounts, and skim the markets, use their references and their expertise to develop your product further and to then penetrate the market further. In the long-term development, you want to look above the rim, involve more stakeholders, expand the functions and the uses of your medical device, and then further on look into establishing new golden standards and looking into reimbursement. In all those disciplines, regulatory affairs plays a game, and you start notching the direction of your project and twisting the knots from the very beginning in order to achieve long-term or strategic goals. Now, first of all, we want to ask a simple question. In a liberal capital market, why do we need regulations and regulatory affairs? Let's reflect back in history. In the time where ancient folks, here as an example, presumably a Chinese picture, use snake venom to cure diseases or to enhance the skills, the establishment of scientific proof was, of course, far, far away. And probably folks do not want to have unproven devices or pharmaceuticals in consumption today. This is where regulators come into play. They want to ensure that medical devices are safe and effective. And one of the newer causes for recast of the European regulations is, of course, the breast implant scandal from the PIP company, here depicted from the implants in France. And it shows very tangible that regulatory affairs is, of course, a discipline where you want to access a market with the most high sophisticated product ever, And it also reflects what a recall can look like. A recall can be an update of a software that is regulated, such as medical device software. And it can also be the explantation of an implant and its replacement with a proper device. Of course, having a recall for implants is something you don't want to happen and you don't want to have. Also, not the publicity associated with it. Not only the European but worldwide obligations for manufacture of medical devices are established with one single central goal. Ministries of health have one target, and that is to ensure patient safety and to sustain public health. In order to promote that, medical devices and pharmaceuticals are regulated so that product performance, reliability, and clinical validity are demonstrated before it is being sold to consumers or users. Later on, traceability and vigilance activities play a big key in monitoring your product and its real-life performance in the market and to allow recalls wherever necessary. Product stability, shelf life, and advertisement controls are of course single key, and there are certain markets where advertisement are stronger controlled than other markets. Looking here at the French market where the advertisement is kind of the highest in the world, again reflecting back to the origin of the PEP scandal. Medical devices should not be outdated but state-of-the-art, so they should be assessed according to foreseeable misuse, according to their concurrency of clinical state-of-the-art, technological state-of-the-art. But you also want to look into whether the product imposes an unacceptable risks or whether mitigation measures, whether being labeling or in design, need to be placed into it. This all is kind of the key principles of medical devices regulations worldwide. And the one market might phrase it a bit differently than the other market, but the key principles stay the same. Now, first of all, in order to know when to apply a medical device regulation is to know when to fall into it. Note that in most medical device regulations, there is a definition of a medical device, and we're going to assess that particular example from the EU Medical Devices Regulations 217/745. Here it says medical device means any instrument, apparatus, appliance, software, implant, reagent, material, or other article, which means anything that is intended by the manufacturer to be used alone or in combination for human beings for one or more of the following specific medical purposes. Note that in opposite to the European Blue Guide, software is recognized as a product by itself. That is a novel paradigm that has been first introduced 2016 by the IMDRF and then later on 2017 by the latest revision of the MDD. I'm sorry, that was 2007. And following that, the manufacturer, of course, needs to be identified. There is one single manufacturer, and the manufacturer needs to phrase an intent what the medical device should solve. And that needs to be very specific, and that needs to be focused for human beings. If we look closely, human beings could also mean a population, but on the other side, population management does not necessarily meet with specific medical purposes. Human beings are also excluding animals. For animals, there might be dedicated regulations or no regulations at all. A specific medical purpose can be diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, prediction, prognosis, treatment, alleviation of diseases. That is a modern interpretation. Note that prediction and prognosis have been added with the MDR, and those terms were not given in the former medical devices directives or in other IMDRF documents. So we see here that any software or any product which is intended to contribute to a disease or disability or investigate a pathological process or state. Think of imaging equipment. They only create images, X-ray images, but they're not used to, they're not the diagnosis, they're just images, but they're used to investigate the anatomy, whether a bone is broken or not. So those parts are medical devices by themselves. A special part of medical devices are in vitro diagnostic devices. In vitro diagnostic devices take specimen derived from the human body, including organ, blood, and tissue donations, and create insights that contribute to medical diagnosis or therapeutic decisions. They are special medical devices. There can be also medical devices that are no medical devices in their own right and that have no medical purpose, but they are regulated equivalent to medical devices as such, and they are controlled in the European Medical Devices Regulation in Annex 16. Those can be, for example, devices that are used for plastic surgery. Being beautiful is a personal feeling and is not a disease. So being ugly is not a disease that can be treated, but disformation might be a pathological process or state. But just for the purpose of beauty surgery, those products are as invasive as surgical instruments. Hence, the European legislators made a good decision forward in order to regulate them equivalent to medical devices because they expose patients and users with identical risks. Now, the first rule of Fight Club is to put everything under one roof. That roof is called the intended purpose. The intended purpose is the blending of an intended use, that is the notion of a manufacturer, a phrase sentence, and what is the intended use of a medical device. It's intended to diagnose a certain thing, to treat a certain thing, or to be used to measure a certain vital or physiological parameter. Of course, the intended user blends also into the intended purpose. Note that professional users might have different requirements to medical devices than lay users. Technological characteristics are then used to fulfill this intended use. They must not exceed it. There must not be any function that is not compatible with intended use. Otherwise, it would be off-label, and either the function would need to be removed or the intended use needs to be broadened. Also, from a labeling perspective, advertisement and promotional material, of course, needs also be under the roof and in line with the intended use, thus blending into the concept of what we call today the intended purpose, the mixture and the blend of the intended use, the users, the technological characteristics, and the advertisement and promotional material. Well, there are some borderline products out there, and discussing the borderline and determining whether a product meets the definition of a medical device or not is a task on a daily basis for regulatory affairs. Here we have two examples from NetDoctor and WebMD, whether they claim to identify 750 symptoms and 560 diseases identified based on the weighting of those symptoms. And at the end, there comes a big disclaimer saying it's for informational purposes only. Yeah, but in the end, they tell you to go visit a physician or dial 911 because there might be an emergency at hand. You don't want to be in that borderline and providing diagnostic or treatment recommendation and at the same time disclaiming that very function that you're doing at the same time. That does not create big trust, and honestly, this is why I discourage from using those products at all. Playing with the borderline, however, is a discipline where regulatory affairs is key. So whether you want to penetrate the market very quickly, the regulatory qualification might play a significant part into the game, whether you want to associate a true sales value with your device in question or not. Associating a value creates, of course, more the demand and tendency to affix a CE marking compared to whether the technology is only a bridge technology to encompass or to promote other values that allow medical decision making. Now, unfortunately, there is no global concept yet available. Legislators tried to phrase common rules, and one of those common rules governed by the IMDRF, the International Medical Devices Regulators Forum, was the Medical Device Single Audit Program, or short MDSAP. MDSAP was an idea to recognize an audit that has been done by one jurisdiction in another. Now, as jurisdictions differ, of course, additional requirements needs to be encompassed. And as jurisdictions differ, and not every country is part of MDSAP. It's only a selection of 5 countries, and only 1 or maybe 2 of them are actively using that concept as a mandatory part in their regulatory approvals. And the significance is, of course, lower. And the global market as such is not existing from a regulatory perspective. We have local markets. So in each market, in a business plan, the regulatory status and justification for each product needs to be assessed. And of course, if the regulatory status is that it is a regulated device, then the business plan needs to be evaluated and the license needs to be obtained. The fees need to be paid. And of course, if the change happens, then everything needs to be held over again, which does create, of course, a lot of work and sustains the job of regulatory affairs. The second rule of Fight Club is to know which rules to play with. Note that there are two significant rules. One is the legal obligation to do something. It's a shall requirement. It's non-negotiable, and the only part to get rid of it is actually deem it not applicable by saying that's not the technology we're using it. For example, if you're not applying ionizing radiation, legal requirements to those are not applicable to yours. So you justify it, write them down so that everybody can see that later on. Now, a legal obligation is usually a high-level requirement, meaning its meaning is to secure a safe and effective medical device, but it's not really looking into a particular technology or into a particular state of the art. This is where the standards and guidances come into play. They explain how the legislators intended to have that law applied. And of course, they explain how the current state of the art is when it comes to standard, and expect the industry and and especially the manufacturers to follow that. So those are the should requirements. And of course, they are established. It has been taken a lot of time to establish standards and guidance papers. So it is out there. And if you do not want to follow that, there might be a good reason for that. You document it and write it down so that notified bodies and auditors can see it and can assess that decision. Looking to notified bodies. Well, you will include at some point in time, in most of the cases, depending on risk classes, we'll look at that later on, a notified body. That is an external agency that assesses the quality management system and the efficacy and safety of a medical device in question. They look into an established, documented, and implemented quality management system, which is applied and maintained actively by the manufacturer, which means every change is taken forth. If it's not documented, if it's not written down, you don't have evidence that you ever did something. So it's not existing to an auditor. You will receive a finding for that. If you established your own rules, how to comply with the law, that's called a quality management system, and that's totally normal. And if you're not following those rules, you're not complying to your own rules, you get the finding for that. Now, if your quality management system, however, is in the unlikely event not fulfilling the regulatory requirements, you're actually violating the law. You will get a finding for that, and not only by the notified body, but probably the national competent authority will also knock at your doors and ask a few questions. So be mindful in what you need to comply with. Be sure on that, and spend enough diligence for there to identify the particular requirements in place and document them. Now, the question is now, what is the common paradigm to access the markets and to have the common playing grounds? Well, as we've learned, each market, like the European Union, the United States of America, or Brazil, or Singapore, they all play a bit of different rules. So we need to obtain a market license in each of those countries individually in order to be able to sell in them. Being able to sell a device in a market, the market access, doesn't necessarily mean there is a market, meaning advertisement and of course reimbursement discussion play in those games as well. Well, the ground rules, of course, play down to the laws and the standards. The laws are somehow the how requirements. They tell you, the laws are somehow the what requirements. They tell you what is expected to be done, but as state-of-the-art moves, the how requirements may differ. Those are very important standards which you should look into when you're developing medical device software. There is an ISO 13485 standards, Quality Management System for Regulatory Compliance. This is one of the mandatory standards worldwide. It is similar to the ISO 9001 standard, which is not sectorial specific for medical devices and in vitro diagnostics, but looking at all products. And sometimes jurisdictions want or recommend to also have an ISO 9001 certification, even though the standard was not particularly intended for that sector. Following the quality management system, ISO 14971 establishes a risk management system at each manufacturer to identify, assess, qualify the risk, determine an acceptable risk threshold, and implement mitigations to those risks that are not acceptable for use. Mitigations can be a technical mitigations or labeling mitigation like a caution warning. In order to overcome language barriers, ISO 15223 is a standard that holds pictures of symbols that are commonly acknowledged worldwide. So whenever you got a caution warning or a symbol to use, you might want to use that standard in order to avoid you with unnecessary translation costs. Yes, translation is a key. So regardless of whether most of the folks on the world speak English, Chinese, counting the numbers, local regulations usually mandate that the common language or the official language in the country spoken is also implemented in medical devices, instructions for use, and user interface. Deviations for professional users might apply. IEC 27001 and IEC 80001-1 gain more and more importance for software being as a standard for integrating that software into a network or into an environment or having a security lifecycle. IEC 62366-1 is the usability standard for risk related to user evaluation. IEC 62304 is the infamous standard for software development with a V model in it, coming from high-level specifications to software units and then testing them back. Here, of course, the appliance of IEC 62304 can be questioned for machine learning products. However, parts might apply, such as establishing a requirement before programming or implementing it. Next to management standards, technical standards such as FIRE, HL7, and DICOM play well into the game, depending, of course, what your product is aiming to do and which technical requirements to follow. Note that here, especially if you're aiming for reimbursement, national standards might be very important. And also from the Digital Health Act in Germany, IEC 27K is compulsory. Now, the question is, how do standards match or map to laws? In the European Union, there's a concept about harmonized standards. Harmonized standards have been introduced in 2012, and they explain that a requirement in the law is able to be fulfilled by a certain current state-of-the-art standard. Now, that standard might fulfill an entire law, only parts of it, and the European way in translating that is the so-called Annex Z. The Annex Z is understood to be a mapping table between the clauses in a standard and the articles in a law where they refer to. Now, the harmonized standards is an important tool for manufacturers because it allows them to have a presumption of conformity. Presumption of conformity creates a, in German called Beweislastumkehr, meaning the manufacturer is presumed to be in conformance if he or she follows harmonized standards, and other challenging parties such as notified bodies and national competent authorities must disprove that fact to manufacturers. Other way around, if manufacturers like yourself don't follow harmonized standards, you are in the position to prove that you are fulfilling the law to the necessary extent. Now, what do standards mostly refer to are the general safety and performance requirements, short GSPR, that are located in Annex 1 of the MDR. Now, we're talking about the law here, and now we're coming with an annex. So the question is, what is the relationship between the annex and the law? Well, we look in Article 5, where it says placing on the market and putting into service. Now, placing on the market and putting into service are significant concepts in the European single market and are honestly a singularity for each product unit. It means, and they express it like this, a device is placed on the market or put into service only if it complies with the MDR in this case, when duly supplied and properly installed, maintained, and used in accordance with its intended purpose. We remember back, we phrased an intended purpose statement before. A device shall meet the general safety and performance requirements set out in Annex 1, which refers now to this annex for the general safety and performance requirements. A clinical evaluation is compulsory for Article 61. However, the extent of the clinical evaluation might depend on the maturity of the technology applied for the medical device in question and does not necessarily need to encompass a clinical investigation, a study in every case. Health institutions can also manufacture medical devices on their own. This is a very important part but it doesn't exclude them from being mandated to follow the medical devices regulation. They need to follow the MDR, but of course CE marking is only needed if the product is being placed onto the market. That is, if it is being transferred into another legal entity, for example. Annex 1 itself has three major parts: the general requirements, requirements regarding design and manufacturer, and requirements regarding the information supplied, like instructions for use. Let's have a bit of a look in them. So specific requirements can, of course, be very applicable. And one way to fulfill them is to think of Annex 1 as a big checklist. So the first thing you do is to translate that part of the law into a checklist and find those parts which are not applicable to your device in question. So for example, if you're software, probably you don't have a chemical, physical, and biological property. However, if you have anything touching the human body, you might want to look into that. Specific requirements can also encompass substances, infection or microbial control, devices incorporating materials of biological origin, construction of devices, and interaction with the environment. Think of machinery, moving parts, devices with diagnostic or measuring function, accuracy units. You can't use non-metric units in the European Union. Protection against radiation, of course, only applicable if you apply radiation. Electronic programmable systems, that's software. Active devices, that's software, and devices connected to them. Particular requirements for active implantable devices. Mechanical and thermal risks. Supplying energy products, and of course, special products for lay users. So when it comes for usability evaluation for professional users, you can presume a certain level of education. If you're aiming for lay users, you probably think of the dumbest person imaginable. Also, when doing a pitch to an investor, or even before addressing your product to a notified body, you want to search and do a short investigation. There's free data available worldwide, being at the US Food and Drug Administration's MORT database, the BfArM database, or the Swissmedic databases. All databases, all regulators worldwide maintain databases about reportable events and incidents from manufacturers. Now, if you got a similar technology, you want to ensure that your product does not do the same mistake than your competitor does before. So you want to scan the database before you enter the market. And of course, that task maintains after you've placed those products into the market, because then you have the vigilance and surveillance activities. And you also need to look at comparable devices from other manufacturers, whether they had a problem and this problem can occur in your setup as well or not. In any case, you need to detect and note it down. And if it's a problem that needs to be encompassed, you need to put it into R&D and risk management and redevelop or rectify your device's design. So before you do the same mistakes anybody else did, you want to check those in the public databases available. Now, Article 62 already was mentioned, and it talked about the clinical evaluation. So let's talk about the concept of a clinical validity. Now, there's a usual question that comes, and it all begins with advertisement. And when we look back in advertisement, sugar was advertised as a product to help you eat less. Today, we know it's doing exactly the opposite. And violet rays or X-rays don't let us glow, and especially not in a healthy way. And I've never had a physician who prescribed or recommended me a fresh cigarette. Those are things from the past, and we don't want to have that quack again. This is where Article 7 of the MDR comes into play. It says in nice words that anything that may mislead, so that could mislead a user, again, think of the dumbest person imaginable, by failure to ascribe functions or ascribing functions that you do not have, or creating a false impression, or failure to inform or suggest different uses, is in violation with the law. So whilst advertisement and marketing departments can be very creative and ad hoc create answers to current challenges, you might want to reflect if those answers are in line with your evidence in the technical documentation. If not, you need to bring up this evidence and complement your technical documentation, or you need to change the design of the medical device in the first place. So my recommendation is here, before you do an advertisement, do your reflection, maybe a short review, or include your especially clinical claims in your clinical evaluation report. Now, how to discriminate now a clinical from a technical claim? And that's a question that comes out very often. Let's discuss that with some definitions from the MDR and from the IVDR. When you have a positive impact of a device to the health of an individual, you're meeting MDR's Article 2.53, and that positive impact can be expressed in terms of meaningful, measurable, patient-relevant outcomes, or outcomes in relation to diagnosis. That is a clinical claim, and it needs to be substantiated in the clinical evaluation report. The MDR and the IVDR talk also about the positive impact on patient management and on public health. So whether claims are raised here, and the qualification might be nudged in the one or other way, and especially those claims need to be substantiated in the clinical evaluation. The middle path is the IVDR Article 237, and it is more similar to the function of a software to contribute to screening or aid in screening, monitoring, diagnosis of patient. That's from the IVDR. And also here we have a claimed clinical benefit, and that needs to be encompassed here in the performance evaluation of the in vitro diagnostic software or product. So any other claim, nice startup time, good usability without a direct relation to a claimed clinical benefit is a technical benefit and needs to be substantiated in the technical documentation by having a bench test, for example, available. Now, clinical evidence is a very important concept, and it means clinical data and clinical evaluation results pertaining to a device for sufficient amount and quality to allow qualified assessment whether the device is safe and effective. Now, the important concept is here that the data for your device is, of course, a very important factor. It also means that you need to come up with clinical data. That is, you need to perform a clinical study. You need to determine the sufficient amount and the expected quality of your clinical data, of course, beforehand. What you also can do is use clinical investigations on equivalent devices. What is equivalent? We will discuss on the next slide. Scientific reports and post-market surveillance play also here into this game from PMCF, the post-market clinical follow-up. We've mentioned that already in the screening of the post-market databases, for example. Now, the thing is, if you're introducing a device and you're doing a clinical investigation, that's one point to do it. Screening literature and assessing, of course, the input criteria, qualification on similar devices needs to be determined. Now, what is a similar or equivalent device? Equivalence in per se is a triumvirate, and all three pillars need to be met in order to declare a certain part of a literature as equivalent. It needs to meet equivalent technological characteristics. So here, especially similar specifications and properties are important here. And when we look at technologies, we probably would not have access to competitors' specifications, and with that, technical equivalence to competitors' products is a hard way to demonstrate if we do not have insights. If it's a well-established technology, it is probably more easier. If it's a novel technology like artificial intelligence, it is probably not doable at all. Clinical equivalence refers to the same clinical condition or purpose, including similar severity and stage of diseases. So at what point in time in the care pathway the product is applied for. Whether it's used for prevention is something different than when it's used for cure or for mitigation. Biological equivalence refers to materials and substances utilized, especially when looking at biocompatibility. So also here, the concept of equivalent is important and limits, of course, the application of third-party literature to the extent where technology is probably well established. So when I know market access conditions for one market, it's going to be the same for all products. Unfortunately not. So the concept of accessing a market is, of course, in the manufacturer's hand. What you need to do is written down in Article 10 of the MDR. And in short, manufacturers need to describe procedures or relevant tasks relating the compliance with the MDR, have a way to store and to retrieve data on a long-term basis. Here in the MDR, we're talking about 10 years. So you need a technical solution at hand to store your technical documentation. And this explains, of course, why paperwork is still a thing in regulatory affairs. We also need to provide scientific proof through researches or studies that devices are still clinically effective. And of course, everything needs to be documented. And this is the part where the MDR comes into play. Now the question on OEM business. OEM means I'm putting my name on an already existing device that I've contracted or procured from an original manufacturer, and I'm selling that as a private label manufacturer. Well, in this case, the problem is that every legal manufacturer, that is every manufacturer that is placing a device on the market, whether just rebranded or originally invented, need to draw up technical documentation. So rebranding a device means that I, as a rebrander, need to have access to the technical documentation, the declaration of conformity, to issue a declaration of conformity, and to conduct vigilance and post-market activities. Of course, I can do a contract and outsource a lot, but the responsibility relies with me. And if I do some outsourcing to the original manufacturer, I can't spare the efforts, but control that outsourcing in a sufficient way. On the other side, and I know there's an error in the slides, I will correct that before handing them out. The UE system is based on a continuous assessment of entities and technologies. And one of those very important players is a notified body. A notified body is a private entity, so it's a business relationship you're doing with a manufacturer. And that notified body needs to be designated by a national competent authority, NCA, and they're controlled by them. They visit manufacturers unannounced and announced, and they regularly take samples of devices and look into the technical documentation and post-market screening data, so that they ensure that the manufacturer is applying the MDR in a compliant way. Manufacturers, except for class 1 devices, beginning with class 1 sterile and measurement, need to apply for a notified body, and that explains, of course, why the public discussions of notified bodies is so important. If there's a shortage in notified bodies, there's a shortage in bringing those medical devices to the market. Notified bodies and scrutiny procedures and external oversight is depending, of course, on the risk level of a medical device. Note that with the class 1 or class A, you probably never meet a notified body, but you're only engaging with national competent authorities, starting with class 1 sterile, class 1 measurement, or class 1 reprocessable surgical instruments, as well as class B in vitro diagnostics. A notified body comes into the game and is, depending on the risk class, supervising you every year, or maybe a bit lesser or a bit more often. Now, the conformity assessment path, and this is where I stole the image from Emergo, is depending on what risk class medical device and what type of medical device you are manufacturing. So when you're manufacturing class 1 device, you want to look into Article 52 of the MDR. It says Annex 2 and Annex 3 needs to be followed, so you need to draw up a quality management system, risk management system, technical documentation, post-market screening, and you're done. For class 1 measurement, sterile or reprocessable, you initially need to look into Annex 11, Part A and Part B, and need to choose either one of those. For Class 2A, you can follow the original path and go with a production quality assurance type assessment, or you want to go for a full quality management system and technical documentation, depending on the demands of flexibility to introduce changes more frequently than the notified body supervises them, or if you have no expenses to set up a quality management system. In that case, the type examination might come more at handy. Now, the question, of course, is how do I determine in which risk class I'm falling? And that is where Annex 8 of the MDR comes into play. Annex 8 holds classification rules, and newly introduced into the medical devices regulation is a new rule called the Rule 11, which looks in particular to the risk of independent software or standalone software. Rule 11 can be divided into three major parts: A, B, and C. The first part holds a nasty word which makes it difficult to apply without having guidance how to follow the Rule 11 in an effective way. So Rule 11 says software that is intended to provide information which is used to take decisions with diagnosis or therapeutic purposes is classified Class 2A, except such decisions have an impact that may cause